Today we'll talk about the card site that ruled the world, how Mt. Gox became the biggest Bitcoin exchange and took billions to the grave. You're coding a card trading site for Magic, The Gathering. It's 2006. You're the founder, a 25-year-old programmer from New Orleans, and your idea is painfully simple. Players buy and sell cards to each other online. You take a commission. The site is called Mt. Gox, Magic, The Gathering Online e-exchange. You register the domain, write the code in a few weeks, launch it. Nothing happens. Traffic is negligible. Nobody needs the idea. You abandon the site. Literally. You just stop developing it. The domain floats in the air, the code goes nowhere, the server costs pennies a month. You move on. Other projects, other ideas. mntgox.com collects dust on your list of forgotten registrations. 3 years later, 2009, you read an anonymous white paper. 9 pages about decentralized electronic money. You're a programmer. You understand the math. You immediately see. This isn't a joke. This is something real. And you think, if this thing takes off, people will need a place to buy and sell coins, a market, an exchange. You already have a domain, a trading site, a template. The biggest financial catastrophe in the history of cryptocurrency began because someone didn't want to pay for a new domain. 2010. You rewrite Mt. Gox as a Bitcoin exchange over a few months. The design is Spartan. White background, order table, deposit form, nothing extra. You launch in July. First month, a few dozen users. Trading volume, laughable. But the Bitcoin market is so small then that even a laughable volume is enough to become the world's biggest exchange. There's almost no competition. Mt. Gox is by default the main place where people buy and sell Bitcoin. You're alone. No team, no investment, no office. You write code, answer support emails, keep the books in a spreadsheet. The site grows slowly but steadily. Bitcoin price, a few cents, a few dozen cents. Then, $1. 2011, the first hack. Hackers get into the Mt. Gox database and access the balance table. They don't steal coins directly. They do something smarter. They manipulate numbers in the database and list millions of Bitcoin for sale at 1 penny. The price crashes from $30 to zero in seconds. You manage to halt trading and roll back the transactions. The crisis passes. You write a post about a technical glitch, minimize the details, reassure users. This is the first signal. But the market doesn't react, because Bitcoin keeps rising after recovery, and people want to believe everything is under control. Human psychology works like this. When an asset is appreciating, any warning signals look like obstacles on the road to wealth, not warnings about the cliff ahead. That same year, you make the decision that will change everything. You sell Mt. Gox, 80%, to a French programmer who lives in Tokyo. The reason is simple. You no longer want to deal with operational management. You want to build new things. The new owner, we'll call him the new owner, takes the money, takes the site, gets to work. The founder sold the future epicenter of financial catastrophe and left to build other projects. He still thinks it was the right decision. The new owner, 26 years old, self-taught programmer, perfectionist in small details, and catastrophically unprepared for scale. He moved to Tokyo a few years ago, lives there with a cat, loves Japanese culture and cooks elaborate French dishes in his spare time. He is a competent engineer. But what happens with Mt. Gox in his hands requires more than just an engineer. It requires a banker, a lawyer, a risk manager, and someone who can say no to thousands of clients simultaneously. The new owner is none of these people. But for now, it's 2012, and everything looks normal. Volumes are growing. New users register every day. Mt. Gox now processes 70% of all Bitcoin transactions in the world. 70%. This isn't an exchange, it's infrastructure. Without Mt. Gox, Bitcoin simply doesn't function as a market. The new owner rents an office in Shibuya, a fashionable Tokyo district where designer boutiques stand next to ramen bars. He hires a small team, buys new servers, pays Japanese lawyers for licensing consultations. On the outside, it looks like a real company. On the inside, chaos disguised as enthusiasm, code written hastily, security systems patched from crisis to crisis, Bookkeeping kept so that no external auditor can understand where the real money is and where it's just numbers in a spreadsheet. The new owner is convinced he'll sort it out later. The market is growing. There seems to be enough time. There is never enough time. But that understanding only comes when it's already too late. 2013. Bitcoin breaks $100, then 200, then 1,000. Every price surge brings a new wave of users to Mt. Gox. People who saw the news, opened an account, deposited money, and want to buy. Servers hum. The support team drowns in tickets. Withdrawals are delayed for weeks. First due to technical problems, then due to banking restrictions, then simply because the system isn't built for this volume. The new owner writes public posts explaining the delays as technical difficulties. He's not lying. The technical difficulties are real. But he doesn't say the main thing. Mt. Gox has no proper audit system, no proper wallet accounting, no proper control over how many Bitcoin are actually in accounts versus how many are just numbers in a database with nothing behind them. And behind the scenes, something is happening that almost nobody knows about. Since 2011, someone has been methodically stealing coins from Mt. Gox's hot wallets. Not all at once, in crumbs. Small transactions that are easy to hide in the noise of a large market. A vulnerability in the code, known as transaction malleability, allows an attacker to manipulate transaction identifiers so that the system thinks the money didn't arrive, send it again. The system sends it again. The attacker receives it twice. Repeat. Hundreds of thousands of Bitcoin were disappearing a few coins at a time, for years. And nobody at Mt. Gox noticed. Because nobody checked whether the numbers in the database matched the actual coins in the wallets. By the end of 2013, about 850,000 Bitcoin had vanished. At the price of the time, over $400 million. At the peak price of 2021, over $50 billion. The company that processed 70% of global Bitcoin transactions was hollow inside. Like a beautiful box with no bottom. The most terrifying thing about this theft was its invisibility. It wasn't one loud hack with headlines about hackers. It was a quiet, methodical, almost boring operation. A few coins today, a few tomorrow, a few the day after, months, years. If anyone at Mt. Gox had compared the real wallet balances against the database numbers once a month, they would have noticed the discrepancy after the very first month. But nobody checked. Because nobody thought they needed to. The new owner knew about the problems. He didn't know the scale. Or didn't want to know. He kept answering emails, speaking at conferences, blogging about new site features. Tokyo around him lived its rhythm. Metro, neon signs, restaurants with automated food ordering machines. Everything looked normal. Everything kept moving. And then, it stopped. February 2014. Mt. Gox halts all withdrawals. The official explanation, technical maintenance. Forums explode. Users who had waited weeks for their money understand. Something is wrong. People with signs appear in front of the Mt. Gox office in Shibuya. They stand in the Tokyo February cold and hold placards. Return my Bitcoin. Cameras roll. The news spreads around the world. February 7th, the new owner removes all Mt. Gox entries from the official Bitcoin Foundation website. February 17th, an internal document leaks online, the crisis strategy draft. It states in black and white, Mt. Gox is insolvent. 850,000 Bitcoin are missing. The company is effectively bankrupt. The document is unsigned. The new owner disputes its authenticity. But the details are too precise to be fake. February 24th, the Mt. Gox website goes offline. Completely. The page won't load. Trading is halted. Money is frozen. About 127,000 users around the world go to the site and see a blank screen. The world's biggest Bitcoin exchange disappeared in a single night. Not because of hackers, not because of regulators, simply because the page stopped loading and never loaded again. February 28th, Mt. Gox files for bankruptcy in a Tokyo court. At the press conference, the new owner appears on camera, pale, in glasses, in a business jacket that looks slightly too large. He bows in the Japanese style, as is customary for a public apology, and says he is sorry. Journalists sit in the hall and wait for explanations. The explanation, 850,000 Bitcoin no longer exist. Where they are, unknown. When they disappeared, not known exactly. Whether they can be recovered, almost certainly not. Bitcoin's price falls from $800 to $400 in just a few days. People who had deposited savings into Mt. Gox, sometimes a decade's worth, sometimes borrowed money, stare at a blank browser screen and try to understand what happened to their money. Some cry, some write angry posts, some leave messages on forums explaining that they don't know how to go on. The new owner is arrested in 2015. Prosecutors bring charges of embezzlement and data manipulation. The trial drags on for years. Some charges are dropped, some confirmed. He receives a suspended sentence, not prison. He still lives in Tokyo. At the court hearings, the new owner looks like a man who genuinely doesn't understand how things got so far. Not because he's a talented actor, but because most likely he genuinely didn't understand in real time. He was a programmer who thought in terms of code, not balances. He saw bugs as technical problems, not financial crimes. The line between incompetence and fraud in his case is so thin that the court spent years trying to find it. The founder, meanwhile, moved on long ago. He built 2 more crypto projects. Both became billion-dollar ventures. The person who inadvertently launched the biggest catastrophe in crypto history rewrote the code and started over, twice. And something unexpected happened with the 850,000 missing Bitcoin. In 2014, the new owner suddenly finds 200,000 of them on an old wallet he had forgotten about. The remaining 600,000 are still considered missing. But the liquidators appointed by the court began a lengthy repayment process. 10 years later, in 2024, the first payments finally reached creditors. In Bitcoin, not in dollars. And since the price had risen hundreds of times over those years, some creditors received more than they lost in nominal dollar terms. People who waited 10 years for their money got it back, and it turned out that waiting was worth more than any alternative investment. But that's not the moral to take from this story. Most people didn't wait. They sold their claims for pennies in the early years. Some lost everything in the literal sense. And even those who received payments spent 10 years in courts, on forums, and in correspondence with liquidators, instead of living. The real twist is different. Mt. Gox did for Bitcoin what no marketing campaign could have done. It proved that the industry cannot exist without regulation, auditing, and accountability. Every centralized exchange after 2014 began publishing proof of reserves, evidence that real coins match the numbers in the database. Cold wallets emerged as a storage standard, insurance funds, independent audits, regulatory licenses. All of this is a direct response to Mt. Gox. The paradox is that the catastrophe made the industry stronger. Not immediately. After the Mt. Gox collapsed, the market fell and stalled for almost a year. But then it grew hundreds of times over with different infrastructure. The major exchanges that followed were all built on the rubble of the trust that the new owner destroyed. They knew what to do differently because they had before them an example of how not to do it. The new owner sits in Tokyo, in the same apartment with the same cat, writing code for new projects. The founder builds his latest venture and avoids interviews about Mt. Gox when he can. And somewhere on a Japanese court server lie the bankruptcy proceedings documents. Thousands of pages describing how a card site with no bottom lifted and buried the first era of cryptocurrency. And how from that grave something grew that was larger than what lay inside it. Write in the comments, would you have trusted your Bitcoin to Mt. Gox in 2013? Or would you have kept them on a cold wallet? And if you want more real stories like this, well, you know what to do.